Welcome to the annual Scaling Up Community of Practice annual meeting. We're really thrilled that you've joined us today for the education session. My name is Heather Simpson, and I am a co-chair of the Education Working Group with Gail Simon, who is also on the line. And we help organize the education sessions, and we're really thrilled that you've joined us today. I'd like to extend, again, this is the 7th annual workshop of the Global Community of Practice on Scaling Development Outcomes. And today we're going to be talking about education and how we can scale learning, and really hear some wonderful insights from colleagues who have been working and implementing and investing in scaling for a number of years. I'll get to the meat of the session soon. I do want to welcome back the 2,500 current members of the Scaling Up Community of Practice. I don't think they've all logged on to this session, but I do encourage those of you who have joined for the first time, and this is your first Scaling Up Community of Practice session, welcome. We encourage you to join the community. The more of us who can share our insights with each other around scale, the better. I have been part of this community of practice for a number of years now, and I always learn from wonderful colleagues, wonderful perceptions, and experience across this community. So do join the community of practice. It only gets stronger with the bigger scale we can get to talk about scale. The community of practice is completely voluntary, it's free of charge, but we're only as strong as our members. So each new voice makes us even stronger. The community of practice is dedicated to advancing and professionalizing the practice of scaling by learning across sectors. So this is a topic, today we'll be talking about education, but there are a number of different working groups, and there's a lot of scaling insights that really do cross-cut sectors, geographies, and I've always had a really rich experience learning from folks who are working in different sectors and in different parts of the world. In addition, this annual workshop, the Community of Practice issues quarterly newsletters, we produce knowledge products, and we have 9 different working groups that explore scaling through the lens of various sectors and thematic issues. And each of those working groups hold quarterly virtual meetings, and there's a web page for the Community of Practice website as well. So do check out scalingcommunityofpractice.com is the website, and we'll make sure you have links to that. And if you want to know more, please always feel free to reach out to info@scalingcop.org. And again, thank you so much for joining today. And for a few housekeeping sessions for this particular session, we are recording this session so that other folks can listen into it in the future, or we can reference back to it as well. Please make sure your microphone is muted and your camera's off. I don't think everyone has the possibility of unmuting yet, or putting on their camera. We will be using the chat function though, so please do use that chat function. We were planning on using the question and answer panel, but that's not working for everybody. So we'll be using the chat function to please do add any comments or questions in there. We may not be able to get to everything during this now a little less than an hour and a half, but we will be referencing back, and all of your questions and comments will be really rich food for thought as we continue to think about these issues collectively. You can also access live interpretation in either French or Spanish. Select the Kudu button on the toolbar at the top of your screen. I think that is what I am told to let you know. And thank you. And now we're going to launch into the session itself. So again, as I mentioned, we are the education working group on this community of practice, and I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome some wonderful colleagues who will be talking about their experience, their reflections on scaling learning outcomes, scaling education interventions, and really affecting scale in this area. So Sergio Ramírez is the Chief of Party at World Vision for the All Children Reading Grand Challenge. And I'll talk a little bit more about World Vision and then introduce Sergio a bit to welcome him to speak to his experience. We also have Paul Frank, who's a senior advisor for SIL Lead, an NGO serving minority language communities. And we have, I'm also thrilled to welcome Creesen Naicker, the Vice President for Strategic Partnerships at Curious Learning, and his colleague, Stephanie Gottwald, who is the one of the co-founders and Vice President for Content and Research at Curious Learning. So we're really thrilled to welcome both of them. And I'm Heather Simpson. In addition to working with Gael to help co-chair the education working group at the Community of Practice, I'm also the Chief Program Officer at Room to Read, which also focuses on scaling up literacy and gender equality all around the world. So without further ado, I do want to we're going to start with Sergio. Sergio, as I mentioned, is at World Vision. And prior to Room to Read, I used to work at Save the Children. And I really love to reflect back on the partnership that Save the Children and World Vision had as they were trying to increased scale of learning outcomes across both of these really big organizations. They recognize, at least from the Save the Children perspective, would love to hear Sergio from his, but the Save the Children team at that point recognized that both of these organizations at that point had sponsorship programming, and they were organizing with other sponsorship-led organizations geographically, so that those private resources were reaching different communities and different children with their education programs and not overlapping. But they also recognized that if they were able to not only coordinate geographically where they were investing those private resources, but also think about how do they come together and strengthen each other's programming so that the learning outcomes could go to bigger scale. And so Save the Children and World Vision entered into a really interesting partnership where Save the Children for a couple decades had been investing and designing and testing and refining their Literacy Boost program at that point. And they were implementing that Literacy Boost program through with their own private resources, as well as in some of their project-based work. But they were able to work with World Vision to come up with a really creative partnership model at that point, where World Vision was also looking to scale learning outcomes and really lean into improving literacy globally. And one of the avenues that World Vision took was to partner with Save the Children so that World Vision could start adapting the Literacy Boost methodology for their own programs and using World Vision private resources as well to integrate those tested literacy models and approaches into the programs that World Vision was implementing directly at the time with their own resources. So I always think of that as a really fascinating scaling model where different organizations had their own resources, but were really looking at how they could leverage learning materials and other expertise to reach and scale deeper learning outcomes. So I think there's a lot to learn from that experience. That's not the sort of thrust of our conversation today. But at that same time that World Vision and Save the Children were going into partnership, World Vision was also using their own resources and serving not only as a direct implementer, but also as a donor and an investor. And World Vision entered into partnership with USAID, with the Australian Development Organization, and creating this grand challenge for scaling up literacy. And now, Sergio, without much more rambling of mine, I do want to invite you on. And Sergio, you're the chief of party of this All Children Reading Grand Challenge, and would love to hear your perspective on how World Vision has leaned into being a donor in this space, in addition to your direct implementation, but and entering into partnership. And how do you think of what role has the Grand Challenge played in scaling learning outcomes?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Heather. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you. Yes, I'm just we had the prep call a couple of days ago or so, last time. I was just thinking about the reference. You know how the model. There's two stories to tell today. One is what it became literacy boost, and that was the original intent of how to do the measure. And how today, through the collaboration between Save the Children and World Vision, the work that it's being done at this point has become more institutionalized. So it is interesting for me, as I have joined World Vision, as the unique difference of your World Vision from other organizations is that they both collect, have public funding from grants and cooperative agreements, but it's a heavy part of it is also sponsorship funding. So the funding that they collect through foundations, through individual donors. So the implementation model for scaling in this type of organization, in our work, is through those area programs that are long term, which allows for, in the case of education, to really invest not through a project model, but through a long-term area program, 5, 8, 10 years, so that we can see in the case of what Literacy Boost and World Vision move that scaling that model into what it's called the Unlock Literacy. And with one of the things that came and I'll move into the All Children Reading is that was tied into the MICA UDL application. And that's where I would say I would start with ACR, so the EdTech side of scaling. So the Grand Challenge on our end it has 3 core objectives. The Grand Challenge, let me just, for those who may not remember what this Grand Challenges were started by USAID in the late 2000s. All Children Reading is the second longest running Grand Challenge. And the idea of the Grand Challenges is to bring to the table people who typically don't bid on these contracts, cooperative agreements, or new voices, the private sector, small innovators, people who, as I said, typically do not come to the table because they're not in the contract mechanisms that usually fund a lot of the work that USAID does. In the case of All Children Reading, we partnered with USAID, a third, Australian government another third, and World Vision US as the third partner. So the unique thing about this Grand Challenge is one that has been going on for 12 years, second longest running Grand Challenge, and the only one in education. And the idea of having two government agencies and a large scale NGO as partners, equal partners in the work that we do. And it's very important because it is equal partnership. So the Grand Challenge has been very focused in this final year, so as we closed round 3, and we have tested solutions on reading. It's all focused on reading, EdTech for reading. In the early part of the Grand Challenges, we focused a lot in incentivizing new ideas, like the applications that I think Curious Learning will talk about, Feed the Monster, which is one, or Bloom Library, which is what our colleagues from SIL, Paul, will be talking about, and their journey to scales and the challenges to scale. And our vision was to test, identify promising applications, games, software, even training materials that could be used for the most marginalized. We've been testing them during the second part, and in this last round, we have focused a lot on scaling. How do we scale? The findings are the findings we have to date are that scaling is aspirational, and it's a long journey. And I think our colleagues on this panel will talk about one thing is scaling with the project funding or the funding that is provided through the grant challenge. But how do you maintain you can probably do it while the funding is there. How do you leverage the funding to go beyond and scale to sustainability? And that's where our biggest findings today are three. The three things about scaling that I wanted to share with the group is the findings to date from all the 90 plus competitions is that scaling doesn't happen because you talk about it. It has to be timed within the needs of each one of the countries. Scaling is the amount of money you invest in an innovation, a game, an app, or something. There's not necessarily a correlation. Sometimes people think you need a lot of money to scale big and a little money to scale slow. I think so. It really the investment doesn't necessarily predict the outcome. I think what the investment in scaling, the third finding for me, Heather, is that scaling is a long-term process, and it happens. You have to take into account the market forces out there, where so it's not so much a supply driven from grant challenges like us, but demand driven. And how do you break through at the local level, at the country level, in the use of these type of applications? So that's still a challenge, and I think there's going to continue. The last final thoughts I wanted to say, Heather, is that we as All Children Reading are really taking advantage of the one phenomenon that hadn't happened in education, which is the COVID. COVID really forced all our education systems to go remote at some point, little or a lot. It forced education teachers and everybody to look at digital technologies and as a way to continue delivering education, not to replace our classrooms, our whiteboards and classroom instruction, but as a benefit. The challenge we see today about scaling is that, and at least my final thought is, as we work towards what happens the next 10 years, is we see that as COVID has receded or is endemic or is treated more like one of our, like flu and other things, and schools go back to quote unquote normal operations, that more than a third of those remote learning processes and applications and games are falling off, are not being used. So now the challenge as all grant for scaling is, hey, we had this big push to get educators to look at digital learning, which usually they're, a lot of teachers are very reticent to use it. I mean, children are, but teachers are always hard. How do we, in this new environment, leverage and not go back? How do we address the learning loss with these fabulous tools, the digital learning tools, and all the project models like Unlock Literacy or Literacy Boost, with leveraging EdTech and keep pushing scaling at the local level, especially in the education systems that we have? Because as I can see already, ministries are lessened as things go normal, go back to normal. We're going to lose the lessons learned from the last 3 years. And last but not least, is these applications build what I say resiliency in education systems. So it's imperative that scale to sustain these and other applications, so that when the next pandemic, the next crisis, the next conflict is, our education systems are ready, able to deploy, roll out, and not have to reinvent the wheel another time. Sorry, I went a little long, but I hope, Heather, that gives you sort of a context and of what, as a grand challenge, we are looking at scaling.
Thank you, Sergio. I really appreciate it. And we'll continue some of these threads as well. Paul, I want to turn to you. So the SIL leads and the Bloom software that the team have been, and it's more than a software, but the Bloom innovation has been part of the Grand Challenge for a good number of years. So Paul, I'd love your insights on what role has the Grand Challenge played in scaling Bloom, and any of your other thoughts as well. But I want to turn to you now, Paul.
Well, and thank you. I appreciate the invitation. Maybe if you show the next slide, they'll set a little context of what Bloom is. SIL and SIL Lead are language-focused organizations, and we really want to support underserved languages around the world, of which there are thousands, literally. So Bloom was developed in one particular country, in Papua New Guinea, as a tool to help minority language communities create books in their own language, because nobody else was going to do it, and they have no books. And so that's the basic idea. Very simple software combined with an online library. Bloom already existed and was functional at the time when the Grand Challenge, All Children Reading, held a software competition, and they laid out a set of specifications. We want software that will help people create books like this, particularly for reading acquisition. And so Bloom already met quite a few of those specifications already. So we threw ourselves into the competition and added the additional capabilities that were needed, specifically focused on reading, and were winners of that competition. There was prize money, $150,000, that we really appreciated getting, and that were an infusion of some money into Bloom. But I would say the role that the Grand Challenge really had more significantly was putting Bloom on the map. All of a sudden, you know, it's getting announced as a winner of this thing, and there's publicity and so forth, and Bloom became known to a much wider circle of people and institutions, and began to get uptake fairly organically as people looked at it and saw what it could do. And that has led, you know, we continued to apply to successive competitions or grant opportunities, and did have a series of those, which are part of what led to an expansion to the library to where it is today. It also opened up opportunities to do work for organizations that saw Bloom as a solution for what they were trying to achieve in their project, typically USAID reading projects. So those opportunities enabled us, or gave us opportunities to broaden the reach of Bloom into new places, new organizations, new languages, new books. And so much of that expansion was due to our participation in All Children Reading and the recognition and resourcing that we received from All Children Reading. So it's been instrumental in Bloom getting to where it is today. If it's okay, maybe I'll show a few slides just to say, so where is it today?
Sounds great.
So let's look at the next one. So these are simple reading books. We're not talking about great literature. We're talking about books for children to read. Now you can see back in 2017, which is when we first started tracking metrics, that was several years after Bloom started. The very first year, Bloom had 864 books. 5 years later, we have the numbers actually in excess of 12,000, but these are ones that somebody's actually read online or in a reader app or something. So that's a huge growth. The same with languages. The first year we had the library, and we had 3 languages represented, books in 3 languages. And we have 300 languages plus where people are actively reading the books. There's actually more than 500 languages represented in the library. Let's go to the next slide, please. The next couple of metrics we've gathered. The first year we had 10 instances of somebody reading a digital book. And late in 2022, we passed 1 million reads. And so, as you can see, around 2000, that took off. If I remember correctly, that was about when the library, you began to be able to actually read books on the library, on the web. And so now people, read PDFs offline. They can read the books on the web. They can read in the Bloom Reader app, and 1 million reads. And then people can also download resources from the library. And the first year, we're tracking metrics at just over 10,000. And end of 2022, 178,000 downloads of one or another type of resource. Let's look at one more slide, please. Now, expansion in reach also means where is Bloom being used? And it was being used in 2 countries, probably the United States and Papua New Guinea, to tell you the truth, at the beginning. And we have recorded usage in 179 countries now. And from 4 to over 80,000 people that we're able to perceive are using resources. So that kind of gives you a glimpse of that expansion over the years. And so we're just really pleased with how far it expanded and the role that the Grand Challenge had in helping that come about.
Thank you so much, Paul. That gives great context, and we'll pick up some of these ideas as well as we continue. And Creesen, I want to turn to you and Stephanie now, and hear about Curious Learning's journey on scale, and again, as another recipient and not beneficiary, but an implementing partner on the Grand Challenge, would love to hear some of your perspectives on scaling your work as well.
Thank you, Heather. Just double checking, everyone can hear me, or you can hear me,
yes.
Heather? Right?
Sounds good.
Okay. Brilliant. So I have Stephanie with me. I'll do most of the talking for this part, and I have her to answer all the questions because that just makes my life easier. So Curious Learning, we're sort of okay. Well, maybe hit whoever's controlling the slide deck, just get all the text up on the slide. I'm gonna not go through the presentation. I'm just gonna talk about this. There's 2 slides in this deck that I really want to speak to, but I'm happy for everyone to have this deck because it's a pretty easy read, and it gives a lot of background to the organization, right? But we're kind of, we're laser focused on early literacy, and we believe very strongly that you learn to read best in a language you already speak, right? So it's not a language learning tool. It's a tool to help you to learn to read in your language, and also very, very focused on making sure that everything we build or use, develop, is open source and Creative Commons. So those are some kind of the founding principles of the organization, right? But we came together as a group of people who had expertise in kind of disparate fields at the time, but we're talking user-centered game design, neurolinguists like Stephanie who started to understand how the brain learns to read in a way that we hadn't actually understood previously. We kind of knew how to put a curriculum together and the pedagogy of how to do it, but we didn't really understand the neuroscience behind it. And by having some really interesting conversations and then having technologists join the conversation, we realized that the proliferation of touchscreens and now even net connectivity was going to be a game changer on how you deliver early literacy material. And we pretty much made the guess in 2014 that the poorest households would end up with devices, right? Over time, and that's becoming more and more true as we follow trends. So what I'd love to do is with that as a bit of a background, I'd love to skip ahead in this presentation to slide 6. Actually, I think I can take control of this. Yeah, I can. Let me do that. Yeah. Okay, there we go. Well, actually, let me maybe give you the answer to that. See how this works. Sorry, entirely. Okay, there we go. So, Heather, can you see the slide?
Yes,
the distribution
I do.
test. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So, our relation to the Grand Challenge is, amongst the many pieces of content that we've worked with, built ourselves, or adapted and localized, was one of the winners of the Edu App for Syria part of the Grand Challenge, and we took that, which was originally in Arabic, and localized it into over 50 different languages. And so initially that was just a test of scaling a piece of tech, right? A tool that was, that was a content scaling that we did. And then after that, or not after, because you're constantly improving the content, but what we next needed to try and work is how do we crack the distribution nut? And we just over 5 years have tried numerous things. And this slide shows, sort of an X and Y axis here of different projects or different ideas we've used to try and test scaling. On the Y-axis is the reach we've achieved in terms of a number, and on the X-axis is the cost per child that we reached. And this is a learner. This is not just a child sitting in a chair in a classroom. This is someone who's actively engaged with it, because that's the metric we can use when it's a digital format. And the size of the sort of circle or the dot on there, is the time to start implementing. So we've just kind of scaled that as well. But what we started to see is that reaching out directly to parents and using digital channels to reach people was the quickest and cheapest way to get kids onto our material. Now, obviously, these numbers are going into the low 100 of 1,000, right? So we don't know what this is going to be thereafter. But we did some tests in Nepal and India, and then we followed up in Kenya and South Africa, and that led us to a point in time where just under a year ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we could turn on a campaign where for less than $10,000, we reached over 100,000 kids in less than 100 days, right? So we actively had kids learning while they were seeking shelter or moving, and those kind of numbers just astounded us, because that was the first time we turned it on as a crisis response in that way. Now I won't talk too much about all the other dots, but what I will talk about is the next slide, which kind of summarizes what we've identified as these as groups of distribution channels, and the pros, the cons, and what we don't know yet. And the first one is the most obvious one, the one that I would think most people would think of first, which is the system. Ministries of education, large multilateral donors or implementers, and the serious pros are they have large reach and a lot of credibility. In Africa, one of the things we've done rather well, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is get kids to school. 25 years ago, that was a very different picture to now, but our learning outcomes haven't improved. UNESCO is saying that less than 12% of kids are learning to read at grade level by the time they're 10. So the cons to us trying to work through that system is how long it takes, the fact that this solution is just a little bit too innovative, maybe a little bit too far ahead of what they're either prepared to or capable of implementing. There's a very admirable approach of leaving no child behind, but it kind of means that you can't start anything, because we can reach 50% of kids in a country if we have enough resources behind it relatively quickly, and then you can really hone in on, okay, what's the solution for the next 50%? Be those reading disabilities and or really vulnerable kids that are very difficult to access. But we wouldn't be able to get anything off the ground in within the system. So So we're yet to make that happen. UNESCO has did a very good job of helping us speak to over 23 different ministries of education in Africa, present to them, always positive feedback, always excitement around it, multiple people talking to us about how kids in their family are using it, but the reality is we're yet to make any scaled implementation work. So, in terms of mainstreaming, as in the title of this, can't give you much on that. But what I can say is that trusted sources started to prove to be, and those were generally the blue dots in the last slide. We've had, should we say, we've had some successes and some less so successful implementations. Now, those are not us doing it. That's groups like Save the Children, like even World Vision, some of the country offices taking the material. Either they have a community-based program or they're working in camps for displaced people, and they use our material and get some really great results. They're often working with the most vulnerable kids, which is a great example of how our material can be used with hard to reach populations. But obviously the cost per learner is much higher. I would argue that the cost should be, it's worth spending it because it's a child who's not having access to any other learning intervention. And then, people can kind of read the deck, each bullet point later, but we've had success with that, with using what we call trusted sources, these NGOs, CBOs, which is quite exciting for us because we think that's, it's a combination of all of these that we believe is the ultimate way to scale. However, what we're focusing on the most at the moment is direct to parents, and we're using all manner of digital communication, from social media to advertising, PR campaigns, pretty much whatever's available in the country and whatever seems to lend itself to reaching parents. And for now, it has not been extremely sophisticated. It's literally telling a parent, hey, there's this cool app, children learn to read with this. What do you think about it? And giving them a link to click. And parents have the agency to make that decision, whether this is something that they would really like to do or not. Of course, if you have the system encouraging it, and you have celebrities endorsing it, and various other influencers helping raise awareness, it really becomes quite a powerful way to reach people. Based on our estimations, you're probably going to be able to reach about 50% of households quite relatively quickly in almost all sub-Saharan African countries this way. But you then have to work out what your solution for scale is beyond that percentage. Two advantages we have is, one, that the group that you can reach through this digital means is going to keep growing. Between devices and connectivity, this is becomes a more and more enabling environment, and statistics are showing that even illiterate people are now getting smartphones in many parts of Africa because so much of it is intuitive enough that they don't need to be able to read to use a lot of the functionality. So that's quite exciting for us. The second the second part that makes us quite excited is we're not trying to do this alone. We're just trying to do our piece. And if you look at those three columns, there's massive scope for others to pick up and run with what we build, to take it, to distribute it. As I mentioned, we're also open source and Creative Commons, everything we build, which means that when I say take it and use it, it's not just use that material as it is. You can take it and make it yours if that's what you wanted, because ultimately a lot of the material we've used have come from others who've done that. So it's part of that community. So there is more info in the slide deck that relates to the actual apps, the gameplay, some of the data we can track through the app directly. There's also links out to the World Bank has done studies, RCTs, that have shown the efficacy in different settings. So more than happy to take follow-on questions later, even after this presentation, but I didn't want to go through too much, bearing in mind what the theme was, and say that, you know, we haven't quite cracked the mainstreaming part of this puzzle, and we're kind of settled on what we think the immediate route to scale for us is going to be, with that scale obviously having a sort of glass ceiling, and thereafter hoping that, you know, by taking hands, we'll be able to pretty much reach all kids. And sorry, last thing is that there's a lot of other material that follows on from the piece we do. So we're not trying to solve for numeracy and, you know, further reading material thereafter. We just want to bring kids to the point where they can engage with that.
Thank you, Creesen. This is really helpful to understand. There's a couple themes that I want to pick up, and I also want to make sure we leave some room for questions. So I'm prompting folks on the line, do type in questions that you have. We will turn to the questions in the chat to make sure that we touch on some of the things that are sparking in your mind as well. There's two things I do want to probe a little bit deeper on. One is this idea around sustaining scale, and how can we think about sustaining scale? And when I think about the tech space for learning, learning is a process that takes time, it takes practice. Humans need to try things multiple times and have help to really integrate new ideas, new ways of working, new content knowledge, new skills. It is not a one moment thing. Learning happens over time. So in the same way, content, and I heard some of this from both Sergio, from Creesen, Paul, you've alluded to some of this as well. Simply by having the content exist does not promise that people will use it, and just having people click once does not promise that they will use it enough to actually get the learning outcomes that we're hoping for with these tools. So I'm going to pose it to all three of you, but how have you thought about scaling the use of, not only scaling the availability of these tools, but how do you actually scale the use of these tools, these apps? And I think that's something that a lot of different folks who are working are trying to think of. How do we integrate tech solutions into our learning programs or scaling? I would love your insights on how do you actually scale the use of these tools, which can be so powerful when used. So I see Sergio's hand first.
I just want to really thank you very much, Heather, and thank you, Paul, because as I said, Bloom and Curious Learning and the Feed the Monster are two examples of the work that Grand Challenge, Altering the Reading, has been and a factor. I mean, among many other factors, their success. Two things to answer your question. One is behavior changes. You can only bring the tech if you don't change people's attitudes, especially the teachers. So there's the stick and the carrot. Probably the carrot is, I think Creesen mentioned influencers, people who are doing it. It's the thing to do. Children naturally gravitate, and let's be specifically about applications for reading, which is where we are focused. Children are naturally open to using. I mean, it's mostly the adults that resist. So what is behavior change? Number two is I guess the stick a little bit, if this is you need to integrate this into, make it as an integral part of the curriculum of the country. So work very closely with whatever the education authorities are, either the provincial, district, or national, because if it's not part of, built into the use of these tools as part of the toolkit, including textbooks, methodologies, then it won't be done. So they have a carrot is influencers, getting people excited, changing behavior, especially the use of the adults, teachers in particular. B is integrating it closer as mandatory into the national curriculum, or local curriculum as one more must-use tool. So those are my 2 insights into scaling and increasing use. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergio. Paul.
Yeah, thank you. If you could show the last slide in my deck, it's a little example of what can scaling look like. As I reflected on what Creesen was saying, we have had several routes of growth, but I think 2 cases stand out to me as how can more usage actually be produced. Guatemala, Juarez and Associates, working with the Ministry of Education in Guatemala, began to use Bloom and our Bloom Reader app back, several years ago. But during the pandemic, they adopted it as a critical tool for keeping kids reading. So it was it was actually a combination of trusted sources, an NGO, a USAID implementer, and the Ministry of Education, so a systemic partner. And then the direct-to-parents part was that they set up a WhatsApp network with a kind of a cascade framework, and they pushed out 2 books to families every 2 weeks, one in Spanish and one in the relevant Mayan language. And you can see the amount of uptake that actually happened because people were getting those books sent to them at a family level, and a tremendous amount of usage happened then right during the pandemic. It's one of the few cases I know Juarez's research actually showed that children who got these books had reading gains during the pandemic rather than learning loss in that sense. But you'll also notice that a year later, there's a very modest bump. And so one of the lessons is that somebody has to really take the innovation, the resource, and run with it in order to see that kind of uptake last over time. Now, the Kyrgyzstan case is similar. That was USAID project, a reading project, RTI implementation, and they did a big push. You'll see an initial first push, but then kind of 2 waves, which I believe correspond to the school calendar. And I think that one, again, is one where it was an implementer working with the Ministry of Education and having these books used as part of the education system, which is what Sergio was just saying. So it really does take, we have a difficulty doing that ourselves because we're really putting a tool in the hands of others. So we really haven't been able to tackle the direct-to-parents thing that Curious Learning has done. But it is much more than just making books available. Extra effort is needed to ensure that they're getting to kids and that kids and families are looking at them. I'll stop there for the moment.
Thanks, Paul. Creesen, do you have some thoughts on how you scale the use of these your apps beyond the initial click?
Yeah, so our number, when you play a game, right, the engagement is the primary metric, right? Yeah. And if that is a significant part of your app design, is that you focused on user-centered design from a gaming perspective, that kind of starts solving that issue, right? And the other thing that I saw some comments, and some people have alluded to it already, but learning ultimately can be very boring if you do it in a traditional way that many kids experience. Okay. And playing games is something that they just really enjoy. And so getting something wrong in a classroom is often frowned upon. Getting something wrong in a game is encouraged. I mean, if you think about the classic game model, you play until you die, right? Like if we go back to Donkey Kong or whatever, any one of us, Tetris, whatever we grew up with, that's fundamentally in the model of it. You play until you until your character or whatever doesn't continue. And so for us, it's always part of the metric. I saw a question in there saying, how do we measure learning outcomes? For us, engagement is actually the number one thing well, when I say number one, it's not the most important, but it's the first gateway. If engagement's not there, it doesn't matter what the assessments that are baked in tell us, right? Because you lost the child already before you even get to the assessment. And so, yeah, that's our approach to this sort of sustaining the scale we get is to make sure you build it really well. And sometimes that brings us into conflict between, what the child tells us is best and what the curriculum tells us is best. And we generally tend to listen to the child. Stephanie, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, what Creesen alluded to, but didn't make explicit, is the degree to which we work to make sure that we can collect that type of data with all of our tools. So whether it's engagement, that means, how long has the children played with a particular app, how many days, how long did it take them to get from one stage to the next stage? Is there a point at which we're seeing children drop off? And why are we seeing the children drop off at that point? Is it because it's too easy for some kids? Is it too hard for others? Is it, are we making a mistake in terms of the design and making it too boring? All of that kind of data gives us so much information about how we have to design experiences that keep children learning. One of the ways, just as, a tiny piece of detail, one of the ways that we've tried to structure Feed the Monster is that while Feed the Monster is focused on letter learning and learning the sounds of letters, in most of the languages that we work with, we've also tried to get them connected to words as soon as possible. So it's not that the children, learn the entire alphabet before they start working with words, but rather they learn a group of letters before they start working with words. So there's this real boost to their sense of, wow, I'm really reading, I'm reading words now. And we're working on a further model where we would be able to build books into the Feed the Monster experience. So once they've mastered a subset of letters, they can move off and, get the reward of reading a small story using those words and using those letters. So, we try to not only gather the data on engagement, but use that information to create experiences where we can experiment with the idea of how we keep the kids engaged.
Thank you. Thanks, Creesen and Stephanie. Another topic I want to touch on too is this idea of sustaining scale, and putting in a plug for our donor community as part of this community of practice is we do want to continue encouraging more folks to invest in scale, and not only invest in the initial ideas and the innovations that could go to scale and maybe will go to scale, but also invest in scaling itself and sustaining scale. So I'm putting a plug to all the folks who are on this call and anyone listening in the videos later with the recorded session. But Sergio, as World Vision, I know that this grand challenge is sunsetting, but I do want to hear your thoughts on how do you think we can get more donors, investors to take scale seriously. And then I also, on this topic, there are certain donor requirements that may either provide opportunities for scale or might provide some obstacles for sustaining scale. And I think we have, both for Paul and Creesen, we have an interesting two different perspectives perhaps on this. In some of the requirements that the Grand Challenge had around open source content, for some, having the content be open source provides a challenge to generate future revenue if it restricts their ability to get revenue from content that they're creating. For others, it can provide an opportunity to take content that someone else created, adapt it, and generate revenue in a different way. So it's just a really sort of messy, but I think important topic for us to start to chew on. Are these donor requirements, as well as how that sort of is lived and a lived experience as we're thinking of sustaining some of this scale.
Thank you, Heather. I'm gonna just take a quick reaction to your question. Is the grand challenge, one of the 5 key pillars of a grand challenge is influencing the ecosystem of education systems. So as a grand challenge, beyond just focusing or targeting, identifying solutions like Bloom, like Feed the Monster, is really influencing the ecosystem of education, especially with, and there's 2 ways. One is bringing to the table the private sector, but bringing to the table civil society, because there is money or there is funding at the local level. It doesn't all have to be from the global north to the global south. That's one, so very actively. The other one is through, policy changes at the national level. One of the things that we're currently working as All Children Reading is participating in this after the Transforming Education Summit in September at the UN. We are part of a coalition called the Digital Transformation Collaborative, which is UNESCO, UNICEF, foundations, private sector like Google Education, Microsoft Education, and some even sovereign funds in the Middle East, et cetera, are coalescing around the idea that we need to ensure that investment in education increases. We cannot sustain out of thin air or goodwill. Ministries and governments need to continue increasing investment in education, not reducing. And number 2, bringing to the table those market-driven solutions or those corporate social responsibility at the local, at the regional, even national level. For example, in El Salvador right now, the Minister of Education there has made a commitment to match whatever funding that the private sector puts into through the network of private sector for education coalition in El Salvador. So they're bringing, the private sector putting money into education and the government matching it. And of course within that, especially for applications that involve national platform, digital learning as a resource to increase learning. Those are my 2. Again, influencing the ecosystem as a grand challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergio. Paul, maybe I'd love your thoughts on how you've experienced some of the requirements that the funding came with as you're thinking of scaling and sustaining scale in the future.
Thanks for that question. Philosophically, I think we were really in alignment with All Children Reading, wanting to have free software and free open educational resources and so forth. The practical issue is, how do you pay for it? And we are, I think today, even more than just a few years ago, in an era where institutionally, we made this happen by assigning staff to do the work, build the platform, sustain it, support users and so forth. And in an era where money is tight, they have funding for other software projects. And there is essentially no funding for Bloom. So there's this pool of other projects that have funding for the staff resources that it requires to keep it going. So we have really struggled. We created a package for institutions to pay for that would provide them with additional tools, additional places to put their books and make them known and so forth. And we have had some modest uptake on that. I remember, though, in one proposal, we suggested, okay, we're going to have these licenses to Bloom Enterprise as part of it. And the NGO developing the process says, hey, but I thought Bloom was free. And that was what was projected through All Children Reading, this great free resource. And I'm beginning to think if we're really not commercializing something, because that's not how it got started, and many of the communities we want to serve aren't really markets, that maybe there's something more in the global public goods part of the equation where somebody has to pay for it, but it's not necessarily the user who's using the resource. And I honestly don't know how that works, but we need to find a way to sustain the investment in especially the staffing to keep this tool growing and expanding and serving more people. We have not cracked that nut yet.
Thanks, Paul. And Creesen, you, as I understand it, Curious Learning was able to leverage resources that had been developed under other language, to your point, with the Syrian refugees and Arabic, and you've been able to adapt those into different languages and scale using some of those resources. So would love to hear, how have you approached that? How do you approach using some of these open source materials for your own, scaling your own efforts?
Right. I think the departure point was around sustaining the scale, right, of what you do, and a question mark around, well, how do you fund this as well? If you're not just getting paid to produce prize-winning content, what comes after that? Firstly, subjectively, and there's enough, supported by the evidence of what I've read and what I've followed, it's very tough to make money in edtech in general. It's not an easy game, right? Even tougher in my mind to make money in early literacy in edtech. Almost impossible to make money once you start stepping outside of major global languages, right? So the overlap between where it's possible to run an organization doing this work and who's going to pay for it is wafer thin, as far as I can tell. So it's not really going to be driven by a commercial incentive in the same way as it possibly would be where you have a highly competitive market, like maybe English. You want to get kids reading before they get to kindergarten, so you sell the parents that app up then at that stage, or you sell them before they do their SATs. You can sell a product. There's these key moments where you can sell something, right? Now, if you look at prizes in general, they produce some great content, but there's even that content is, you can almost consider as a living piece of work or living product that needs nourishment. And if you think about the Edu app for Syria, so Feed the Monster as an output, if you think about 1 Billion and Enuma, who won the Global Learning X Prize, all three of those code bases are deprecated, which means no one's working on those code bases anymore, the original code base. If it wasn't for Curious Learning picking it up and now taking it forward, you wouldn't be able to use it. There is no Feed the Monster app from the original project, right? And all of this has not been funded by the original project, right? And the same with the Global Learning X Prize. So there's something in there that even before you think about sustaining this, getting to scale, you've got to think about sustaining the product over time, which is, we've learned, I think as a community, we've learned now that we've produced it, because we're suddenly like, oh, Android doesn't stay the same. The rules for how you deliver on a mobile phone don't stay the same, etc. And you've got to keep adapting with this. So from our perspective, we believe in the open source approach to this. We believe that if people can pick up and work off of something that's already pretty robust, as long as you have a big enough community and everyone contributes back into that community, it's going to be more cost effective in the long run, or for anyone to do any next version, any next piece. We've got a group that we've supported, I think it's called Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation, who have built Feed the Monster in Aboriginal languages of Australia, where they've, these are languages in threat of disappearing, and this is their core focus. So this wouldn't, the way we fund Curious Learning, there's no way we could justify that, because of we're measuring reach and numbers on that level. Yet this is a very important piece of work, and for relatively low cost with a bit of our support, but their own cost. They've brought the money in and they're doing the work. They're able to produce a world-class app for communities that barely have books. So that's the argument for, and I can totally understand and agree with the argument against, in terms of, I'm sure if we had some colleagues from Enuma and 1 billion, they could give us some real perspective on, why their subsequent products to the prizes they won are all closed, and they're all like, they're a lockdown kind of product that they sell. And I think they're looking at cost effectiveness at scale. So they're going to try and make it as cheap as possible for every learner. But now they're the gating factor. You can't get to a child with this material without going through them. So that, that's a very important debate to have in this community. I don't, we've just chosen our approach because we think it has more potential, but I certainly wouldn't write off doing it differently in terms of sustaining the scale.
That's wonderful, Creesen. And certainly, as I reflect at Room to Read, we have very active debates on the use of technology and what role Room to Read can play in EdTech, knowing that we don't have coders on staff, we don't have revenue to pay for coders on staff, and therefore we do not want to create from the ground up or sign up to sustain being the original coders or the ones who need to keep it up to be active. We do have a role to play on content and language, and we're a book publisher as well as an expert on supporting teachers to improve their work with children and with adolescents. So we are continuously trying to figure out who are the partners that have the resources, that not only the money resources, but also the knowledge and the staff resources to bring those elements to bear, and how do we partner with EdTech groups that can sustain the ongoing work of making these technology solutions workable. Even as the hardware shifts and changes, the software can be updated and sustained as well. It's very active debate, and one that I appreciate having, and sessions like this help me also think differently about some of the partnership discussions we could have as well. I do want to pivot to some of the questions in the chat. One from Johannes, which he posed to Paul, but I want to pose it to you, Creesen, as well. As, do you have a scaling vision and long-term targets for metrics of where you want to be in 5 years when it comes to scaling? And what are some of the constraints that you see in reaching that 5-year goal, if you have them? I'll start with you, Paul, and then shift over to Creesen again.
Well, part of the answer is we don't have a concrete goal or vision. We as an institution, our desire would be that a significantly larger number of underserved language communities would be using Bloom and benefiting from it and creating the literature that they want. Then, and the primary barrier to that is resourcing to support a team that you were talking about, having a software team who is focused, who's responsive, who's innovative, and to serve communities that aren't going to be paying for that as a product. And we have tried to find some other ways. I think, honestly, we're going to have to find some donors that believe in serving that kind of communities that want to make that possible, and or find institutions that think our solution can help them achieve their goals, and that would be longer term, not just a project-based utilization, but a longer term partners in helping resource as well as deliver good solutions.
Thanks, Paul. Creesen, do you have a vision for your scaling strategy the next 5 years and beyond?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's definitely.
I'm going to hop in here and say that at Curious Learning, we've always been really ambitious. And it is very much our goal to reach a very, very large number of children. Well before the pandemic, we've known that education was in a deep, deep crisis, particularly in low-income countries, and that around every 3 years, we lose an entire generation of kids. So all the solutions that we're talking about that take 5 years and 10 years and 15 years means that we're taking it for granted that huge numbers of children, we're just essentially writing them off because we know we won't reach them. We hope that in 5 years that we can, in low income and other potentially middle income countries, can reach the approximately 55 million children that are entering the school system and make it possible for them to be competent readers. We believe that we can do this for as little as $15 million a year, and we are actively fundraising to reach those goals.
And what Stephanie's talking about is just based on what I showed you about our distribution test. Right? We have to test this at scale to know. But the projections on costs are pretty astounding in terms of if we can take a massive chunk out of the problem, then we have a lot more resources to focus on parts of the problem we haven't solved for. And when I say we, I'm talking about the community. I'm not talking about Curious Learning. Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to clarify that we have never seen it as our goal to, let's say, for instance, provide a grade 1 to high school education for children, but rather we think we can focus on early reading skills and getting kids to be proficient readers. And then there are sufficient resources out there, or lots of opportunities for kids who are readers to take advantage of either going to school or other digital opportunities. But to be honest, even if they don't have access to those resources, just knowing that they can read changes their life in we all know in really dramatic ways. So that's the goal that we're focusing on, and yet we want to achieve that goal in a very deep fashion.
Thanks, Stephanie and Creesen. Sergio, I know that the grand challenge is sunsetting. What vision do you have for scale? And I do want to applaud USAID and World Vision and the Australia government for really approaching this as a decade of investment in scale and really sustaining this for that period of time. I will often reflect on what Larry and Johannes talk about, that scale does take time. It takes developing trust, it takes relationships, it's human behavior change that takes time. And so I do applaud that this grand challenge has had some time, even though not every single grant recipient received funding for that full time, but collectively you've been engaged in trying to get others to think about this. And again, it is sunsetting, but what is your vision, your hope for scale and over the next 5 years, even as some of the direct funding is going away?
Well, even everything good also comes to an end, but it's only an end to this chapter of All Children Reading. I think the window of innovation continues, even if it may not be ultra-learning like this grand challenge. Two things very quickly. One is we currently have a prize, a scale and use prize for digital books in action, which is co-funded by USAID. So we have an additional money in this last effort to push it further. And in particular here, my colleagues, I think, are participating in that prize to see and demonstrate with small investments, how much more can we reach if we, so that's one. And then we have another small final end prize, because there's digital sign language books in action, which is about scaling at the local level, building the capacity of disabled people's organizations so that they can continue, they own and can continue expanding the use of our digital, the applications, and especially the sign language books in local languages. So I think, my vision is sustainability depends on local capacity, promoting local, the organizations, because there are plenty of great ideas, not only here in the North or in the US, but besides that we need to continue. And three, I think, there are, as World Vision is integrating things like Mika and UL as part of the worldwide education programs, so that we made a commitment, at least within the World Vision partnership, to make sure all education systems are digitally ready, digitally resilient, so that the next crisis, conflict, or pandemic does not interrupt. So we hope there we can find funding and continue, as we do, to a call to action to ensure education systems don't address the learning loss from the last 3-4 years and be built for the next interruption or situation that may happen. So that's our vision right now, and we hope that to continue working in this line of work or this goal. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergio. And I do want to encourage everyone on the call. The executive committee of the Scaling Up Community of Practice has created a really useful principles of scaling document, and lays out different principles, which I have found very useful as I've reflected on my own work with Room to Read team and with partners on how we can scale. And I'd like to pose it to our colleagues here, having had a chance to look at that principles document. Are there any principles in there that jump out at you, that really resonate with you, or other thoughts that you have having looked at that principles document? And I don't know if Paul or Sergio or Creesen, if any of you have some reflections that you would be willing to share with the group here.
Well, I was just exposed to these principles fairly recently, and it is almost amusing or ironic, because this is a framework for being very intentional and deliberate about scaling, and like for us, scaling just kind of happened. So this is like what we should have done, or put it differently, some interesting principles for what we might do now as we look towards those next 5 years and developing a scaling vision. And what is the coalition of partners that would do that? And how can we make that participatory? And what is exactly this that we're scaling? It's just some really good questions to me. It's a principle, but to me it's a question. So how are we going to do X? And I really haven't digested it all, but it's very thought-provoking, I'll say. And in many ways, it's a lot of stuff that we haven't done. And some to some degree, that's not completely true. But so I find it interesting, but not necessarily, I don't necessarily resonate with these like, oh yeah, we learned that in the process. Or like, oh, looks like something we still need to learn.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate your reflections on that. And again, really welcome you to join this community of practice. I certainly have appreciated having some of these frameworks to help inform my own thinking of what we could do next and how we can continue to improve in this space. So thanks for that. And Sergio, have you do you have some reflections on this principles document?
Yeah, I think yes, I'm particularly I'm very visual, Heather. So I love that that graphic representation of how the vision, the how, the plan, the who, and the what. I think when I look at this document, it does give you sort of put in writing some of those pathway to scale. It does resonate with our own internal learning agenda within the Grand Challenges and Innovation Sandbox, because that's what we are here. We're not here only to prize and fund success. We also learn from failure. That's the whole beauty of a Grand Challenge, is both success and failure compared to a traditional contract, cooperative agreements, or other funding mechanisms. I think my main reflection is we need the private sector, those innovators at the table. I think that we in education tend to be the NGOs, the office officials. I think there are market principles that are applicable to education. Education is not free, even though we all believe public education is free. It really costs somebody to run the education systems. And so changing that and bringing some market principles to scaling would probably be my one big reflection on the document, which I really appreciate having read. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergio. And Creesen, I know I'm putting you on the spot and you may not have had a chance to see this document, but we have put a link in the chat for anyone who hasn't had access. But I did want to just check to see, have you seen this document already? And if so, do you have any reflections? If not, no problem.
Cool. Yeah. No deep, meaningful reflections on it. But I am intrigued, and I'd love to. I'm going to engage with it a little bit more. You know, the reality is, I think if we try and summarize what or learn from what has worked in education scale, we're actually looking at the wrong data pool to start with, because I don't see where this has worked. So we're trying to work out how something works by looking at something that hasn't worked, right? Curious Learning, we've just tried stuff and gone down a whole bunch of cul-de-sacs, much like Sergio touched on, and even Paul mentioned. You know, it's kind of happened organically, and then a few things have worked to a degree, and now you test them further. So it's very important to do these exercises of reflecting on that and collating that information. That's an important piece of work, but what we can't do is have a data set that's very incomplete and try and tell everyone this is how you have to do it from now on, because we don't have a full picture of what it looks like to scale yet, and we're not taking learnings from what is it education scale versus digital education scale versus digital scale, because there's a lot of digital scaling that's happened, and we seem to always put education in conflict with digital scale. Like this, before you even try something, there's 10 reasons why you shouldn't do that. But could you imagine if Angry Birds actually had something worth learning in it? Right? I know the guys have done some great work after the fact, right? They've done some unbelievably cool stuff after the fact. But can you imagine if that wave actually taught kids something? You can speak to the people who built it. No one in education wanted to talk to them, right? Until they got to scale. So they had to build the roads, essentially, build a pipeline before suddenly Angry Birds education became a thing. So, you know, there's probably a little bit more in it, and that's my initial insight from having a cursory look at the document already. And yeah.
Thank you. Well, with that, I do want to thank you, Creesen, Stephanie, Paul, Sergio. Thank you so much for joining this session. And I do encourage you to join the community of practice. You're going to help us continue thinking more deeply about some of these issues, learning from your experiences. And we have colleagues who we weren't able to hear their voices today. I see some of the chat, really rich conversation in the chat as well, but we will continue having more opportunities to engage. I do encourage everyone to take a look at that principles document. Let's keep sharing insights from one another. Let's keep learning on how to try some new things, try some ways to scale and share insights with one another, so we don't have to replicate all the challenges, but we can replicate some of the things that are working. And with that, I want to thank everyone who joined today. Thank you to our panelists, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening, your day, your morning, and thanks so much. Bye.